On today's show, Summer League is done and dusted. Unfortunately for the Bucks, it finished with another pretty comfortable loss. But we're going to look at the positives, and we saw by far the best performance from Chris Livingston. The ball was in his hands a little bit more, so we'll discuss that performance from him. We actually saw some Amari Moore as well. So, any final takeaways? I've got a question for Frank about all these young guys that we were excited to watch in Vegas. Which one is he most optimistic about? And then we'll get to some of the salary cap stuff we teased a couple of days ago. John Horst insinuated the Bucks will be over the second apron. Does that even matter? We'll ask Frank.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bucks. My name's Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show Monday to Friday, and also find my work over at ESPN. And alongside me, the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden, for today's episode that's brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 when using the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. And we always thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or first listen of every weekday. Now we really are shifting into the dead of the offseason. This is when creativity is at the core of this podcast, Frank. This is my fourth or fifth offseason. I can't even remember anymore, but we've got some good stuff coming. I'm going to get some other guests from the outside to tell us more about some of the new players on the Bucks. Plenty of fun stuff still coming, and let us know what you want us to talk about. Maybe we can do an old school mailbag. We haven't done one of those for a fair while as well, Frank, but we appreciate the support. Drop a like, a comment, subscribe, rating, review, wherever you're listening or watching the podcast. We really appreciate your support. So for me, this was a little 6:30 a.m. Sunday League action between the Kings and the Bucks, and the Bucks were down big early. And we've seen a little bit of this over the last few games. Highly optimistic when they were 2-0, but they finished this campaign 2-3, and now it is officially over. We asked the question, who was actually going to play in this game, Frank? You did see Livingston, you did see Andre Jackson Jr., AJ Green, and Amari Moore, who we mentioned, who did play 25 minutes. But I think Chris Livingston is the place to start here, because we did ask the question through the first few games. He was kind of just floating out there a little bit. He didn't have the ball in his hands a lot. He didn't have a lot of opportunity to create or perhaps look to score. He was rebounding and making some defensive plays. But in this game, still didn't shoot well from the outside, but he was 9 for 11 on 2-point attempts. He got to the free throw line for 7 free throw attempts there as well. Rebounded a couple of steals and 0 turnovers, Frank. This was by far the most we'd seen of what Chris Livingston can potentially do, and also just individually, his best performance and pretty efficient work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was having this conversation with some people on Twitter, and the thing that I find most interesting about him is, as we've talked about, he's a former 5-star high school recruit. Pedigree-wise, I forget what age group was, but like at one of the, I was U16 or something, but like won a gold medal with Team USA when he was younger. So again, this quote unquote like as a pedigree guy, he ticks a lot of boxes, and I think without that, like the Bucks would not have drafted him and made him this promise, right? It's not like if he was some random dude and did what he did at Kentucky last year that he necessarily would have been on the Bucks radar in the same way that he was. But it's interesting because for a guy who seemingly was obviously very highly touted, highly recruited, et cetera, to see him play, he at 19 already seems to have like completely, embraced and realized that he is not going to have a long NBA career being a, go-to scorer, doing the glamour stuff, right? He's a guy that seems to realize, like, I need to bust my ass. I need to be a grinder. I think grinder is a term Sam Vecini used in his pre-draft scouting report, which really stuck with me, and which I think is something I think we saw in the 5 games in Vegas. He runs it hard up and down the floor. battles on the boards, really puts in a good shift defensively. But it's weird because we were just sort of talking about, it's like, do you see, like, does he play like a guy that was a 5-star recruit? Like, and it kind of cuts both ways. On the one hand, he has, I think, an unselfishness and a humility almost to his game, like Greg Popovich always talks about, like, you want guys that have gotten over themselves. Pretty rare that guys who, again, have this pedigree have gotten over themselves by the age of 19 and seem to realize, like, oh crap, I can't take any of this for granted, right? I mean, he's got guaranteed money. He's got 2 years guaranteed on this rookie deal that he signed. It's talked about, it's the the richest deal for a final pick in a draft that we've seen. And again, a lot of that's just because of the new second round exception stuff. But it's just a weird thing because on the one hand, like, he does all this stuff. Seemingly has like the attitude and the effort level, and he does the little things that you would really want and need a guy, who is just trying to make an NBA roster, right? Like, I mean, he's, if not, the 14th guy, he's the 15th guy on the roster in terms of, maybe not literally, right? They still have one roster spot, but in terms of, who's going to have to fight the most uphill for minutes, like, he's probably the guy. So I think from an attitude perspective, you like that, but then it's like, do you when he plays, like, does he look like a guy that, like, was dominating high school ball a couple years ago? And it's kind of like, man, we're kind of talking about, and I think the history of this that we've heard is, he's a guy that kind of matured early and probably kind of beat up on people in high school, and then he didn't necessarily kind of keep growing so much. And if he was 6'8", 6'9", I think you might feel a little bit differently about kind of his upside. The one guy who I think of when I sort of describe a player who seems to kind of get it as far as being a one and done Kentucky guy that realized he had to really kind of like work his butt off in the pros, Jared Vanderbilt kind of comes to mind. Vanderbilt's like 1 or 2 inches bigger, I think, than him, but they're both pretty sturdy guys. And so we've always seen Vanderbilt kind of carve out a niche as sort of this, like, undersized 4'5", can't really shoot, but like does a bunch of other stuff and is super versatile defensively. Obviously, if Chris Livingston ever got to a level like that, you would feel great. But I think what he did in this game was interesting because, we saw a bunch of steals, some of the defensive effort stuff kind of come through. And then as far as the offense, I mean, the 22 points, I don't think the 22 points, you go back and watch the highlights, I don't think you look at it and be like, oh man, he's a really talented scorer necessarily. A lot of, again, kind of dirty work, being around the basket. I think the one area we have seen from him is he has a little bit of touch around kind of the mid-range. Like, we've seen him kind of dribble into like mid-range shots, hit like little floaters at times over the past week or so, which, maybe belies the fact that he is a guy who scored a ton of points in high school and did all this stuff prior to this. So it's not like he was, just, dunking on little kids on an Nerf hoop or something like that for the last decade or something. Like, yes, he does have real skill in some regards, but yeah, just a really interesting guy. I think you look at him, it wouldn't shock me at all if a year or two from now we just say, like, well, he's still the same guy. He can't really shoot, hasn't really developed his own, like, he doesn't really seem to have much instincts as far as passing. The ball handling is like kind of sketchy at best. But he's a guy that's he's gonna go down fighting, and I think you got to give him credit for that. And I was kind of happy for him that he was able to kind of finish Vegas on a high note with those 22 points and kind of stuff the stat sheet a bit in addition to that. So I don't know really what to make of them. I hope the Herd offer him, obviously you expect he'll get plenty of time with the Herd if he's sent there. And I would expect that'll probably be the case. We'll probably spend a lot of time in the G League this year just trying to get reps because, and like, he just needs a lot of skill development, and I think athletically too. He's very I think he's very like physically mature in terms of like strength for his age. But like we saw in the first half, I mean, he went up for a one-handed dunk in transition. He got rim checked, which isn't exactly like what you'd expect to see of like an A+ athlete. So I don't think he's an A+ athlete. But we've seen, I mean, that's an area that, NBA strength and conditioning coaches can do things with as well. So again, hopefully there's something more that kind of can be unearthed there. So kind of what is his destiny? I mean, I think it's probably, as that, like, can he become a very switchable 3-4? Again, we can kind of talk ourselves into the PJ Tucker, myth of like every guy that's sort of in this size range. We like say, like, oh, can they become PJ Tucker? Can they hit some corner threes? Again, like I think certainly you can tell Chris Livingston to go watch PJ Tucker tape and see what PJ does and see if he can imitate any of that. But there's a reason why there's one PJ Tucker, and lots of guys haven't kind of followed that mold. So interesting player, but yeah, I don't know really what to expect from him, but happy to see him kind of put some things together. And now I think it's just like, if he's gonna earn that contract, I mean, he's gonna have to come back a year from now, and I think look a lot more of a complete player than we saw now.
So Chris Livingston, this performance offensively, you referenced his college stats, but I just looked it up as you were talking there. So his season high point total last year for Kentucky was 14. So he had 22 in this game. And he actually only averaged 5 shots a game last year in college. So this really was an out-of-the-box performance, but still fun nonetheless. And it did feel like he had a few more opportunities in this game. 3 offensive rebounds again. So, yeah, I mean, he is, whether he grinder, scrap, or whatever, like he'll fight for the ball. He seems like he's able to hit the glass, particularly on the offensive end. So we'll see, as you mentioned, at his size, whether there is a role there. But I've got a question, and maybe Chris Livingston the answer, although based on what you just said, maybe not. So I've got a question for you coming out of Summer League in just a little bit after I talk about Prize Picks, long-time sponsor of the podcast. If you aren't aware of what you do with Prize Picks, you pick 2 to 6 players. And if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any of those entries. So I dare say if you're playing Summer League play and you went the over on the points with Chris Livingston, you might be in the money there. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you watch. So obviously NBA taking a little bit of a break now, but you get involved with baseball and the Brewers, perhaps PGA, college sports, whatever's going on there as well. WNBA, of course. NASCAR, tennis, Wimbledon finished this morning. So there are so many sports to get involved with on Prize Picks. Just download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Frank, you put a poll up on Twitter a couple of days ago. You referenced it on this show just before the weekend, and you said, based on everything we've seen to date, which Bucks young player do you value the most moving forward? There's 2,200 votes on this poll. Beauchamp up around 65%. Maybe not a big surprise. And Andre Jackson Jr., 24%. Chris Livingston, only 3%. AJ Green, 9% there. So maybe by virtue of the fact that Beauchamp was a first-round pick, there's obviously higher expectations on what people think he can do. We've seen a little bit of him already. Let's take those guys out of it. So you got AJ Green, Chris Livingston, and Andre Jackson Jr. 5 games of Summer League. Admittedly, not the best or biggest sample size to go off here. Do you have any optimism from those 3 guys that playing on a Bucks roster with better players, perhaps not as much of a concern with the spacing that I think we saw, particularly in the half-court offense in Vegas? Those 3 guys, any one of those players fill you with any type of optimism that we'll get to the end of the season and they've played, I don't know, 50 games and actually become a meaningful contributor in whatever way that looks like? You're on mute, but push ahead once you take care of business there.
Sorry about that, Kane.
Yes.
I had my dryer was ringing.
Oh, we heard.
That was the buzzer. That was not the Kane, that was not the Kane I've got an ad read buzzer. That was the Frank's Laundry buzzer.
In case people are wondering, we've been doing this podcast for a long time, and I've decided after 4 years that I've got a buzzer when I think Frank's been talking for long enough.
I mean, if you did, we'd hear it way more than we do. But let's say this too. I mean, okay, I have not seen a whole lot of any of these guys prior to the NBA, but we have a lot of like data. There's a lot of scouting reports. I think we've all probably watched the scouting videos on all these guys, especially after the Bucks drafted them, and obviously AJ Green. We have a whole season of seeing him in Milwaukee. So again, like some people say, some people will say like, oh well, you're gonna make a final decision on these guys based on 4 or 5 preseason games? Like, well, no, but we're not basing this on 4 or 5 preseason games, right? Like, nobody was saying Victor Wembanyama is going to be a bust because of one preseason game. Like, we had all this data on the dude, like there's a reason why these guys were picked where they were. And in AJ Green's case, why he got an NBA contract this year. And certainly he didn't, show out in Vegas or anything like that, especially with the injury limiting him. Let me start by saying this. Let me give you kind of like the arguments for each of these guys, right? Like, I think the pro case, right? Rather than just saying like, whatever. I mean, again, these guys we're talking about second round picks. AJ Green's an undrafted guy. I mean, of course, these guys have flaws or they wouldn't have been picked where they were. Sure. So we want to, be realistic about that. But let me give you kind of the arguments for each, and then we can figure out which one we buy into most. Let's start with AJ Green, right? AJ Green, he's the guy that has the single most proven NBA skill out of all these guys. We haven't seen Andre Jackson defend or do anything at a high level. Obviously, we haven't seen Chris Livingston, in the NBA either. But AJ Green, we have seen him shoot the shit out of the ball in actual NBA games. Obviously, a lot of those games were kind of, you could say like, wow, he was playing in these random games, and some of them were, not all that meaningful. But he was a guy that all season long you could throw him in there, and whether he was playing 5 minutes or 20 minutes, whether it was, spot minutes because there was nobody else available, or because, Bud just wanted to give him a shot and felt like the team needed a shooter. He made shots, and he made shots above the break. He made shots in the corner. The only place he didn't make shots were at the basket. He was 3 of 6 for the entire season in the restricted area. So he never got to the rim, but know your role. That's fine. And I think defensively, I think he had a much better grasp of the system and what he was supposed to do than Marjon Beauchamp, which is, I think, is a reason why at times AJ Green was playing over Marjon Beauchamp, in spite of the fact that he was not the one that was a first round pick. He was not the guy that had certainly the physical tools that made him look like an NBA player. So I think with AJ Green, he's the kind of default to me, because we've seen him be a, decent NBA player. Certainly for a rookie, he was a good NBA rookie in the limited time that he has. And obviously we can talk about his limitations, but let's focus on the positive. So I think with AJ Green, you can say, I got an NBA skill. I got an NBA role. If you're a team with Giannis Antetokounmpo, what do you want? Floor spacing. What do I got? Floor spacing. And I take tons of threes, 11 per 36, which would be essentially like, top 5 or 7 in the entire league if he had played enough minutes, just in terms of like volume. And to do that at that volume and shoot 42% is pretty incredible. Andre Jackson, the first sentence I think I spoke about him on the podcast, he's a weirdo, not personally, but as a basketball player. And that cuts both ways. But let's talk about the positive aspects of that. I mean, we saw, in terms of like, there were not tons of highlights in this summer league for the Milwaukee Bucks. He authored probably the coolest single highlight, right, with that double block on Peyton Watson in the first game. You can see the athleticism. He's the most athletic, clearly, out of all 3 of these guys. He may not be not necessarily as strong as Chris Livingston, but he's definitely the most athletic of the guys. He will be one of the most athletic players on the Bucks roster this year. And of course, you're all just fighting for second after Giannis, given what he can do. But in terms of like the non-Giannis Bucks, he's about as athletic a player as you'll find. And he translates that certainly on the defensive end in terms of some of the stuff that he's able to do. So, I think if you talk about players and, who benefits from playing with real NBA players, Andre Jackson being surrounded by a bunch of guys who are not great shooters, scorers, proven NBA players, probably is going to be really harmed by that. Because of the limitations he has as not just a shooter, but he just doesn't score, right? He just couldn't score in college, couldn't score in summer league. I think he averaged 7 points per 36. But he's got a passing knack, which it's hard for me to really kind of frame exactly how much his passing is going to matter and how it'll be used. I don't know. Like he does not strike me like a guy that you can just, put in a pick and roll and he's going to go make a shot for somebody. Cause again, he can't shoot and he can't really score himself. So at the NBA level, it's kind of problematic. But I think as a screener and like short roller, I think he could be interesting in that regard. And again, is that going to be something you use with Giannis on the floor? Maybe not. But I think him playing in sort of second units or when Giannis is not on the floor, if he's out there with Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday and Brooke Lopez, that could be kind of fun. Like that could be kind of interesting. Him doing dribble handoffs, him being in the dunker spot, trying to get the fast break going because those other guys necessarily aren't going to be doing a whole lot of igniting a fast break by themselves. So I think there's just a uniqueness to his game. And, you heard lots of people who know his game much better than I do, much smarter draft analysts than I am, talk about him as just a sort of winning player. The guy's a national champion. He started on the national champion team, he led that team in assists, and very unconventional. But sometimes, again, there could, I think there's a clear bust potential, but I think there's also this guy just is different and it somehow works potential with him. So I think that's the Andre Jackson case. And then I think with Chris Livingston, when we just talked about him a little bit, honestly, Chris Livingston is the guy who has he's the most well-rounded of these guys, right? Like if Andre Jackson is going to stick out like a sore thumb because of the limitations shooting and just generally as like a scorer offensive guy, if AJ Green's going to stick out just because all he does is shoot and he doesn't get to the rim and he's small defensively, Chris Livingston doesn't have any of those problems. He also doesn't have any of those really kind of defining NBA kind of clear plus skills at this point. But again, if you're looking for the guy who has the fewest weaknesses and can hack it as an NBA player because he's maybe, doesn't have anything that you can horribly exploit as a defense or on offense, he doesn't hurt you as much as maybe like an Andre Jackson does because of his shooting or something like that. That would be the argument for Chris Livingston. And I think the other piece too with Chris Livingston is he's the youngest guy by far of all these guys, right? AJ Green, obviously, what's he now, 23, something like that. Andre Jackson, I think, is 21 going on 22. Even Beauchamp is almost 23, right? Chris Livingston at 19, turning 20 this season, has just a natural upside from a developmental standpoint that there's no guarantees clearly with that. Every year, right? It's always funny to think about the draft every year because people think about the incoming freshman class, but you always got to bank on there's going to be a bunch of guys who didn't wow you last year in college and they figure something out.
The old internet in the Madden household might have done a number there. Frank's looking very shocked as he's frozen on the screen. I'm glad that he's back.
Was it the Mike Budenholzer face from yeah?
It was Mike Budenholzer, not Mark Budenholzer after he's just had a terrible bottle of water. So it was there's different faces you could have gone.
All right,
to.
so wrapping up Chris Livingston,
yes.
I'll just finish the Chris Livingston. Though, we're pretty much at the end point of that, but again, would he have been a guy next year, maybe a year after? If he stays in college, is he a guy that pops, right? For him, he maybe is a guy that goes back to Kentucky and doesn't play a whole lot as a sophomore, and then the roses, off the bloom or whatever the phrase is, and it's kind of all right, that guy it's just not going to happen with him. So I think it was smart of him to come out this year while there was still sort of that 5-star recruit sort of sheen on him. But I think there is upside there too that maybe he was a guy who's going to figure out maybe that 3-point shot was going to develop next year. Maybe there's something else that he figures out about his game. Maybe there's some physical, athletic development that he would do. So yeah, Livingston is kind of he's not awful at anything, and he's the youngest. That would be the argument for him. So I think there's very different arguments for all of them. Kane, I can tell you kind of I think what my answer would be if you made me pick just one of them. But I want to defer to you. Do you have a one that you would stand out to you at this point, given again limited sample for the rookies, but again, they didn't just fall to the earth, 2 weeks ago without any background. We know kind of what the book is on these guys.
Yeah, this year AJ Green, but just because I think the 3-point shooting is going to allow him to be playable most nights anyway, particularly during the regular season. But whether or not he can do anything else is probably going to determine whether he plays in the postseason. Like, I know he only played 2 games. I know he was battling with an ankle a little bit, but even this game against Sacramento, he took 5 shots or 4 shots, and they were all threes, bar one. And that was kind of the thing to me. I know you already referenced before, Frank, that maybe we didn't need to see him because we kind of know what he's going to look like. But part of me was like, all right, let's see if AJ Green can do something else because we haven't seen it. And unfortunately, we didn't get a glimpse of that. But I still think he's in the best position this year. Obviously, played 35 games last year as a two-way guy, which is like kind of hard to believe. And then long term, yeah, I guess I'll go with the youth. I'd probably go with Livingston only because, I mean, we also know there was some health stuff with Andre Jackson Jr. We don't know fully what that looks like. But Livingston at 6'6", that's still fine size, even though maybe these days you want an extra couple of inches, but that's still a fine size to defend multiple positions. So that's probably going to be the big thing for him, unless you believe he can become a guy that can knock down the corner three. But probably Livingston, just because you do have to remind yourself that, again, that he is only 19. But good for him for cashing in, as you pointed to. You never know with this college stuff whether he would have continued to slide, but to get a guaranteed deal for a couple of years, just from a purely business standpoint, he's done pretty well.
Yeah, and I think the thing too is that like we shouldn't forget as well is the guys that pan out in the second round, right, or undrafted guys. Yes, there are guys that come in and immediately, like Herb Jones, right? Herb Jones, second round pick a couple years ago, comes in and is immediately like, oh my God, how did all these teams not realize Herb Jones was good, right? That his defense would translate, etc. But that's not, like typical necessarily even of guys that eventually figure it out, right? I mean, the other extreme would be our dear friend PJ Tucker, who, how long was it until PJ Tucker like circuitously found his way back to the NBA and actually like carved out and became close to what we now think of as PJ mother effing Tucker? I mean, we're talking like in his late 20s, right? Like it was a long.
But the interesting thing about that, Frank, what you were pointing to about the humility or whatever word you want to use for Chris Livingston, that's something that PJ Tucker spoke about before, that he was pissed on the bench because he wasn't playing. He thought he should have been doing more. So it's not, again, not to say that's who he's going to become, but I think it was a good point by you to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and I think the problem, and I think this is generally, we can talk about this as an aspect of the Bucks strategy with their two ways that we've seen really over the last few years, right? But they haven't necessarily like drafted super young guys consistently, but you look at like their two way, this year, right? Like Lindell Wigginton looks like he will, as of now, he still has a two way. Certainly didn't do anything in Vegas. I mean, he wasn't fantastic, but like Lindell Wigginton can go and get himself buckets, right? Doesn't necessarily make other guys better, but statistically he was way better than pretty much all the other guys that played more in Vegas. But the Bucks have typically had a lot of guys, on two-way contracts. They've kind of got these guys at the end of the roster who are, rookies. And I think it's an interesting question of like, are you actually better off trying to sign guys that are a few years out of college, but maybe haven't proven anything, but are a little bit distanced from college, and whether it's like the quote unquote second draft type guys or whatever you might say, but not go for guys that are like literally just straight fresh off the boat from college and haven't had a chance to be professionals. And they have to kind of go through that whole process in terms of learning as pros, because again, Chris Livingston, maybe he ends up being like a pretty good NBA player, but is it going to be for the Milwaukee Bucks? Do the Bucks get him? They have to sort of help him figure out a lot of this sort of skill development stuff, and then they have to make a call on him because, he doesn't play because the team's good, blah, blah, blah. And then, he ends up 5-6 years from now down the road in his mid-20s, he finally figures stuff out and you didn't get anything for it, right? Like that happens, that's not like commonplace, because again, most of these guys, certainly especially in the late 50s, don't become good NBA players. But that's always a risk too. It's not just, can you find a guy that's talented enough to eventually become a good NBA player? Can you also like develop that guy and recognize it, and then keep the guy on the roster and have him figure that stuff out, on your roster, rather than have to go, wash out someplace and figure out somewhere else, right? I mean, we're seeing now like Sam Merrill lighting the world on fire in Vegas, but you know what? I'm not that worried about Sam Merrill becoming like a good NBA player. Shouts to Sam. But but we'll see. I mean, Jordan Wara, obviously, like they had to like give up picks to get off a very small contract that they got that they gave to him. Had some nice moments with the Pacers. Not a lot of pressure there. I think it's kind of a put up or shut up year probably for him in Indiana this year. So this is just I mean, we're not. I mean, again, like there's no like huge revelation here. But I think it's just this is why it's so hard, right? And even some of the like the Heat guy you talk about, like the undrafted guys. I mean, Caleb Martin was the lesser Martin brother before he got signed by Miami, right? He was they were both, Cody and Caleb were both in Charlotte. Caleb gets released because he's the worst Martin brother, and the Heat pick him up. The first year, I don't think Caleb Martin was like, oh, I wasn't that worried about Caleb Martin. And then, it took a couple of years, and then he has this incredible, postseason run, and now he's this, really hot commodity, So, and Max Strus, right? You talk about how many teams kind of Max Strus bounced around with, right? Boston Celtics had him in camp and cut him, and then eventually he ends up haunting them in the playoffs, right? I mean, again, like it's just hard to develop the talent, hard to identify the talent, and obviously there's a synergy between that talent identification and development piece that is, I think, very hard for us to kind of parse from afar. But I think to answer the question, you answered it. I would say as well, like, who do I feel most confident is going to like be an NBA player that can actually be potentially like decent contributor in the next year or two? I just didn't see enough from Jackson and Livingston in Vegas to feel like it'd be someone other than AJ Green, just given that we have seen him do that. Now, if you ask me, like, who do I think is most likely to actually help you in the playoff series, in a year or two, I think that's maybe a slightly different question. And I think the athleticism questions, do you have the tools to stick as a top 8, rotation guy in a playoff series, which is what we always come back to. I think that that's less of an obvious answer there. And, Andre Jackson, again, I think he has huge kind of bust potential as well, because he just cannot score at all. It seems like not just he can't shoot, like he just does not know how to use that athleticism in his hand. Like somehow the handle and athleticism just do not translate into creating baskets for himself, but maybe playing with good players. Again, he was on a really good team in UConn and he couldn't score. But maybe playing with a good NBA team with spacing and all that, like maybe he's a little more competent in that regard, and maybe that defensive tools kit, is able to kind of pop a bit more. So again, like if you told me that, in a year, maybe not this year, but in 2 years, like, Andre Jackson like has a playoff series where he like plays a really valuable role, like that wouldn't shock me. But yeah, I think there's just probably my expectations, let's say, are fairly tempered for him. And with Livingston, I think his most likely path is, he's probably just going to be a guy. I probably would say long term, I think it's probably hard necessarily to bank on anything with him, but I don't know. I mean, easy guy to root for, right? I don't think he's a guy that you're gonna, from what we can see, I don't think he's a guy that you're gonna say like is gonna, fail in the NBA because he didn't buy in, or he couldn't take it seriously or whatever, right? If draft night suits were indicative of who players are, I think the fact that he was wearing like I think it was a double-breasted suit, but like a pretty conservative down the middle navy blazer and a white shirt, I think that was very fitting for Chris Livingston. He did not come through with a really flashy look. He was like, you know what? I'm going to be the last pick in the draft. I'm okay with it. I'm going to get paid. I'm going to have my chance, and I'm going to make the most of it. And you know what? Maybe that's not going to be good enough. Maybe it will be. But that's just kind of who he is. So yeah, we'll see. And I think we didn't really have a chance to talk. I mean, we can talk about other random guys. I mean, Amari Moore like didn't do anything in Vegas basically until this last game. I was coming into the last game, I was almost like, is he even gonna keep that two-way into the regular season? Like, are they gonna cut bait on him before he even plays, gets through a training camp or something? I think we at least saw a little bit from him in terms of some of the tools. I think he had like 5 steals. He was part of that kind of intense pressuring defense that we saw, and hit a 3, scored some points. And we'll see. But again, it's just like Amari Moore, another guy that I think there could be something there, but as a rookie, like, did you kind of buy too early on Amari Moore? We'll see. Hopefully he's a guy that also gets a lot of opportunities in Oshkosh this year.
Well, my last summer league thought as we wrap this up is AJ Green. You spoke about his volume 3-point shooting. He's a high volume 3-point shooter, but he ain't Craig Randall II.
Oh gosh.
And I saw Craig Randall play here in Australia. He played for Adelaide for a very brief period last year before the team and him decided to part ways. I don't think it was going too well, but he is not shy. And we saw that 17 3-point attempts, 3 for 17 in this game, 17 3-point attempts in 28 minutes, an unbelievable summer league stat line. And that was his first real opportunity of major minutes. And he was not going to waste a single second out there on the floor. Craig Randall, shout out to you. But AJ Green, he likes to let it fly. What I will do is I'll put this poll up on the YouTube channel. So all the viewers, and if you haven't jumped on YouTube, jump on and get involved. I'll put that poll up and see what you all think, and leave your comments there as well. I'm just going to keep on teasing, talking about this salary cap stuff. We're not doing it now. We've been going 36 minutes, which is well over time, and we're going to wrap it there. But Summer League done. Sad time every year for fans and daily podcasters, that's for damn sure. So the FIBA World Cup coming up. Obviously, we're going to continue to break down this roster, get more info on all the new faces here from people that did watch them on a nightly basis through college. I think that's going to be really fun. Plenty more stuff still to come on Locked On Bucks. So continue to support the show. We appreciate it. And we'll, of course, have another show tomorrow. So we'll catch you all then.